I'm going to skip through this, and we started back 5 minutes early from lunch because quite a few people have been and asked questions, and I think Stuart McCartney, quite a lot of people are wanting to ask you questions at the end, so I'll skip through this really quickly, and that'll leave a little bit more time for people to pick your brain, Stuart, if that's all right. Right, as I say, this will only last 25 minutes. I'll skip through it as fast as I can. Basically, it's a split talk. One half is on HAC, which is high alumina cement investigations of precast, pre-stressed bridges, and particularly railway bridges. And the other half touches on what Stuart said earlier about wall tie investigations. So to kick off with the HAC. As I say, HAC stands for high alumina cement, and it's no longer used in the UK. It was banned in 1976. It was initially used as a replacement for ordinary Portland cement, and it was used primarily because it has rapid setting properties, and it's also sulfate resistant. And it was used mainly in the precast concrete industry. Put simply, because it sets rapidly, the precasting yards can get a bigger throughput of their concrete products with less curing time. And it was highly utilised in the 1960s by the precast concrete industry, but in particular in the manufacture of pre-stressed, precast bridge deck beams for the railway and trunk road networks. However, after HAC had been in use and before it was eventually banned, there were a number of catastrophic collapses in the UK. Now, luckily no one was killed and no one was even injured, but there was a few close calls, and there were investigations into why the bridges had collapsed and why, in this case, it was swimming pool roofs had collapsed. And it was found that HAC undergoes a disintegration process known as conversion. This conversion process, unlike just about all other types of concrete deterioration, corrosion, sulfate attack, they're all expansive. Well, this is a contraction reaction. And what happens is the concrete matrix actually shrinks away from the aggregate. And this is a process that takes place from the inside out. So there are no signs during an inspection, there's no cracking, there's no rust staining, there's no spalling, which can lead to catastrophic collapse. This conversion process leads to a dramatic loss in strength, sometimes in excess of 90%. And the failure mode is usually a compressional failure of the top flange of the beam at or around the mid-span. This conversion process is initiated and accelerated by beams or concrete products containing HAC that are in elevated temperatures, elevated humidities, and are subject to wetting and drying cycles. Hence, the number of early collapses were swimming pool roofs, where the roofs had been made out of precast beams, and they were subject to big changes in temperature, very high humidities, and in general elevated temperatures. As I mentioned earlier, this is a shrinkage process, and it takes place from the inside out. So the conversion process with the loss of strength can happen with no visible sign from the outside if it's inspected. It's quite ironic because when I started my career all these years ago, that sounds a bit pompous, when I started working 35 years ago, I was involved in HAC investigations, but over the years, all the roofs with HAC and all the bridges containing beams have generally been replaced. So we've never really heard of HAC for 25 years. So I was very surprised when Ryan, my colleague here, was asked to go and look at a railway bridge, like this one, and it had spalling and rusting on the underside, and we were asked to do what I would call a standard survey to see what the problem was. And normally that there is the underside of an individual beam with the pre-stressing strands exposed and corroding. And we did our standard suite of tests for carbonation, for chloride. There wasn't any chloride, there wasn't any carbonation. And as an afterthought, we tested the beams for HAC, and it was actually an HAC constructed bridge. So, knowing that it can cause problems with the strength, we proved it had HAC and that they weren't OPC beams, and I was worried that it could be undergoing a compressional failure. So we liaised with the client and revisited site, and there was that much of the underside spalling off that in the interim time the client decided to put a safety net underneath to catch any products that were, if you like, the concrete cover to the pre-stressing strands that were becoming detached, to protect the public. So we got permission to revisit the site, and I wanted to look at the top of the beams to see if they were undergoing a compressional failure. And it's maybe not clear to see, but in the middle, that is the top flange of the beam, and the white material is just low-grade infill concrete in between the precast beams. So from there to there is the top flange, and from there to there is infill concrete. This is after removal of the blacktop, and I think you can see that the high-quality precast product, the dark material, is in a worse state than infill concrete that structurally doesn't really do anything. So here again you can see, have I got it right? That's the top of a beam, and it's all breaking up, and that's the low quality infill concrete, and it's intact. Again, showing the top surface all broken up. Looks a bit like frost damage. And we tried to cut cores to ascertain the strength of the concrete. And this is one of the few locations where we could cut a core, and you can see the top portion of the oops, sorry about that, I'll go back. Doesn't want to go back. Anyway, we couldn't really cut cores out the deteriorated areas. The concrete just broke up. And one of the factors about HAC is the concrete matrix. Normally with ordinary Portland cement, normal concrete, the matrix is a light grey, even a blue-grey colour. You'll note that the core's almost jet black. HAC is always black, very dark grey. So as I say, we went back and we cut cores to further investigate the problem. And the trial pits, I think this is... The trial pits confirmed that the top flange of the beams at mid-span, where the concrete acts in compression, had completely converted, and we crushed some cores that we could get out from the better areas, and they were crushing at 9 newtons. Now, a precast concrete beam should have, I don't know, 60, 65 newtons. So you're looking at about a loss in strength of 75, 80% where we could get the core. And at most places, the core just rumbled the concrete into mush. So the bridge wasn't about to, was in the process of undergoing a catastrophic compressional failure at the mid-span. This slide just shows the contrast between the cores. That's out the infill concrete, and it's light grey, and that's out the top flange of the beam, and you see it's dark grey. This is a lump, and I mentioned that there were shards of the concrete cover were exfoliating and falling to the ground. We've picked this up from the ground near the railway track, and if you notice, the matrix is although it's rust stained and there's mineral deposits there, I think if you look between the aggregates you can see that it's a chocolate brown colour. And again, one of the giveaway signs, not that you have HAC because it's black or dark grey, but when the HAC undergoes this conversion process, it sometimes, not always, but sometimes can go through a colour change of the matrix to a chocolate brown colour, and you see that is a sign that conversion of the matrix is taking place. The trial pitting exercise that we carried out in the top also confirmed that the underside of the blacktop, the road surfacing, was in direct contact with the top surface of the top flange of the beams. In other words, there was no reinforced concrete overslab protecting the beams, there was no waterproof membrane, and at this location the blacktop was only 60 mm thick. So you had 60 mm of blacktop straight onto the top flange of the beams. And remember what I said earlier about the conversion process being initiated and accelerated by elevated temperatures, wetting and drying cycles. Well, because there was no waterproof membrane or overslab, the top flange of the beams was getting wet. Because the blacktop was only 60 mm thick, in the summer, the top flange of the beams that was wet was getting subjected to wetting and drying cycles and elevated temperatures, because the blacktop in the summer was acting as a heat sink. So all the conditions were met for rapid conversion of the beams. So we wrote a report that basically said there's 80 to 85 loss of concrete strength in the top flange in general, and complete conversion at mid-span, and it's currently undergoing a compressional failure, and we believe that the deck slab is beyond economic repair. So they decided to replace the deck slab. Nothing really to do with us, the investigation's over. So what you can see here is they've protected the tracks with some temporary works, and they've got some planting to demolish the deck. And the plan is that they would fast track it and demolish the deck using peckers onto the railway line, take it all away, and overnight put in some pre-cast, pre-stressed modern beams to replace the deteriorated ones. And this is just another picture showing the extent of the breakup. It wasn't corrosion that was spoiling this, it was the fact that the slab as a whole, including the individual beams, was undergoing a compressional failure, which meant that the deck was sagging, and this sagging caused the concrete cover to spoil away from the strands. Basically what happened is, after this, our client decided that he wanted to check out a number of other structures, and you'd think it'd be easy to spot which bridges are constructed with HAC and not, because as I mentioned, the concrete's almost jet black. But in a railway environment, the underside of all the bridges is jet black with soot and dirt from the trains. Anyway, I think we've done probably in excess of 100 of these bridges, and some are HAC, a few, Most are OPC, but we've even found somewhere it's a mixture of both types of beams. And we think that if you go back to the 50s and 60s when the railways was built, there must have been a precasting yard using HAC exclusively. They don't tend to mix OPC and HAC in a precasting yard, because if they switch from one type of cement to another, you can get a flash set and it clogs up all the concrete pumps. And when you look closely at the matrix of the black concrete, there is little shell fragments. So we think it must have been a precasting yard close to the seaside that got some of the sand off the beaches, but we don't know where. They did their temporary works. They came along. They built a temporary bridge to take all the services out. It was close to pedestrians, close to the traffic, and the machine went over, stood above the abutments. It took one peck and the entire bridge deck collapsed. So if any vehicle had went over that, it would have been a catastrophic failure. This is just a picture of the night working, because they ran 24 hours. On the right hand side you can see the temporary bridge they made for all the services, and these are the two abutments. We cored those and they proved they could reuse the abutments in the new design. So that concludes on HAC investigations. In summary, it's highly unusual. It appears to be limited to some precast beams, but it can lead to compressional failure. And as I mentioned earlier, when there's sign of distress, that's when the investigative phase comes in, and that's where we're involved. I'm trying to skip through this fairly fast, so I'd like to go on and talk a little bit about cavity wall tie investigations. You saw a similar picture with Stuart McCartney's one earlier. I'll come to that in a minute. Starting in the early 90s, the British government started to procure building projects via what we call the PFI route or initiative. PFI stands for Private Finance Initiative. These PFI projects were usually schools and hospitals, but also included court buildings, colleges, universities. And this PFI route involved a main contractor teaming up with a finance house, a bank, to build a school or hospital. And the education authority or the hospital authority would rent back over usually a 30-year period the facility. And over the last 30 years, 20 years, most of the new public buildings have been built by this finance initiative. This involves the main contractor being the main point of contact. So instead of having an architect, say you were a school, you would appoint an architect who would appoint a structural engineer and an M&E consultant, and then in turn a contractor. The education authority would appoint a contractor in the first instance, and he would engage the architect, the structural engineer, the M&E, and all the various subbies. Unfortunately, a number of these projects have been found to be constructed with deficiencies, gross deficiencies in the way they were built, in particular with the cavity wall ties. There was a school in Edinburgh, and there was a stormy night one night, and I think you can see you can see that almost the whole gable end of the building sucked into the wind. And when they did the investigations, they found that there weren't enough wall ties, and the wall ties that weren't properly installed. As Stuart said, they went and investigated other schools that were constructed at the same time by the same contractor, and found they had the same problems. The schools were closed down, it was in the news, and all the schools had to be retrofitted with cavity wall ties. So eventually the insurance industries got hold of this and started to refuse to insure these buildings until a certificate, because if there was one batch of schools that were defective in wall ties, maybe there would be other batches of schools in other parts of the country for different education authorities where they had the same problem. So we were commissioned via insurance companies to go and check out the cavity wall ties and issue, with the help of a consulting engineer, certificates of conformity. Do they have the wall ties? If they don't have the wall ties, we're not going to insure these. And this involved in doing routine investigations. I think we've done well over 100 of them, and it usually involves cherry pickers and moops to access the sides of the building. What we also found, and as Stuart highlighted earlier, that as well as the wall ties which hold the inner leaf to the outer leaf, the cramps, and these are clips that go onto the steel frame, wind posts that strengthen the wall, and mortar bed reinforcement that strengthen the wall was missing. And we use these impulse radar systems to find the mortar bed reinforcement non-destructively. So we developed a technique of looking at these schools and hospitals. These are cavity wall tie detectors. Conventionally, cavity wall tie surveys are done in old buildings where the wall ties could have corroded. And these wall ties are metallic, as in made of iron, and they're quite big. This is us scanning, looking for mortar bed reinforcement. That's a typical wall tie, a modern one. And the problem is, you can see it's very lightweight and made out of stainless steel. So in old buildings, they have ferrous metal wall ties, which are pretty big. In the modern buildings, the cavity wall tie detectors can't find them because they're lightweight and they're made out of a different type of metal. There's another modern wall tie. You can see it's very small and very lightweight and made out of aluminium. That's a different type. That's a type, again, modern. That one's galvanized steel, and it hooks onto the stud partitioning, which forms the inner leaf, and the brickwork on the outer leaf. So the left bit would go into the mortar, the right bit would go into the stud partitioning. And here you can see a typical area where we've marked up all the wall ties, and we're checking to see that the wall ties are at the right density. Typically every fourth course vertically, and at various centres. It can vary from 850 down to 450. And around entrances like windows and doors, the density of the wall ties. So we're just checking that the wall ties are at the right density. Traditionally, we mentioned that when you're looking for ferrous ties, the old ones, the steel ones, you can use cover meters and metal detectors, but you can't with these aluminium ones. But traditionally, with the old type of investigations, you wouldn't remove bricks, you would drill a hole into the mortar bed and look in with an endoscope. But in old buildings, the cavities aren't insulated. With these, they all contain modern insulation, so you can't drill in and use an endoscope. So we developed a technique whereby we would locate the wall ties, measure up their density, the spacing horizontally and vertically, select a located tie and break it out and photograph and measure it. And here you see a tie. The block work is the inner leaf, and the ties successfully embedded in the mortar bed, and you can see the outer part is embedded in the block work mortar bed. So that would be a tie that's successfully installed. Here you see a couple of pictures, and you see the wall tie here. And if you look down this cavity here, you see there's just no wall ties anywhere. And you look, we've got one wall tie, and you don't see any others. So basically we go around the hospitals and schools, we do these surveys, we open them up. What you can see there is what we call mortar bed bridging, where the mortar from the bricklayer has fallen down the cavity and sat on top of it. The wall tie is successfully installed, but this can cause damp spots in the building because the moisture can travel through. It's not structurally significant, but it can cause damage. Here you see, looking down the cavity, the inner leaf there, the outer leaf of brickwork. You can see the wall ties, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're mortar bridged, but they're correctly installed. Here you can see the insulation, the outer layer of brick, and you can see the wall tie, and you see the hole there. That should be totally inside the mortar, so that one hasn't been installed properly. But it's still installed, but doesn't give the required mechanical fixing. And you see another one, again, inner leaf, insulation, wall tie, hardly touching at all. No mechanical interlock at all. Again, the other one, that should be inside the brickwork. There's another one, it's been installed, and you see they've bent it into position. So basically what's been happening is that when you build a wall, you build 4 or 5 courses of brick at a time. You can't make the brick any higher because the weight of the brick will squeeze the mortar beds below before it sets. And the bricklayers are supposed to set in the wall ties, come back the next day, do another 4 courses of brick, put the wall ties in and go on like that. And what we think the problem is that these contracts were let, this is just my guesswork, these contracts were let under fairly tight deadlines for finishing. And traditionally when you do a construction, you build the outer leaf to height, the inner leaf to height, and you bring them up like that, putting the wall ties in at each level. And we think that they may have decided to build the inner leaf first, so that they get the inside of the building wind and watertight, so they can get the tradesmen in kitting out the building. In other words, get the plumbers in, the painters, the decorators, the electricians, and then put the outer skin of brick up at a later date when the weather's a bit better, you know, into the spring or summer. And but of course, that doesn't allow for the installation of the wall ties. So we think that's what might have happened. But there's another wall tie not installed. I'll just flick through them, there's quite a few. There's one just bent into the cavity, just they've put it into the right hand leaf and the left hand brick leaf, they haven't put it in at all. And these aren't just isolated incidents, it's pretty widespread. Here you see an inner leaf of blockwork, which is there, an outer leaf of brickwork there, and you see all the wall ties, they're all there, but they're just all hanging in fresh air. And it's these wall ties that actually holds the outer and inner leaf, so you don't get these suction effects. I didn't actually realise that you could get suction in the waste sewer as well, I didn't know that. But, again, wall ties not installed properly. So basically what happens is when you find that there's a wall or an element or an entire hospital where the wall ties haven't been installed properly, we sometimes get asked to go and retrofit remedial wall ties, which we do occasionally. To date, we've installed hundreds of thousands of these where we found there's a problem. This is actually a pull-off tester checking one of the wall ties that we've installed, that it's got the right grip mechanical interlock to the inner leaf. I can't remember exactly how many we've done, but it is worth saying that about 50% of the buildings that we've looked at have got issues with wall ties, which is very high considering all these buildings are less than 10 years old. So there was a problem with this form of construction, and we've really went round, as I say, it could be as high as 150 from the north of Scotland to the south-west of England. I'd really like to end, that really concludes the talk. I would just like to end it with a little note of thank you. This is heartfelt. I would like to thank the bricklayers that installed these without wall ties, because it's given us a lot of work and kept me in a job for the last 3 years almost constantly. So that concludes the talk. I'll now hand you over to the next speaker.